February 19, 1945. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima still clung to the morning air when Sergeant James Kowalski first witnessed what 40 yards of liquid fire could do to a fortified position. The Japanese defenders had no idea what was coming. They'd trained for grenades at 20 feet, bayonets at arm's length, and bullets from any distance. But nobody had told them about the new M2A17 flamethrower and its devastating reach that would rewrite the rules of Pacific Island warfare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The island of Peleliu had been declared secure 3 months earlier, but pockets of resistance still festered in the coral ridges like infected wounds that refused to heal. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Brendan of the 1st Marine Division's headquarters company stood inside a bombed-out Japanese command post, studying aerial reconnaissance photographs spread across a salvaged desk. The images showed a honeycomb of cave systems carved into the limestone cliffs of the Umurbrogol Mountains, what the Marines had grimly nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge. Intelligence reports estimated 350 enemy soldiers remained entrenched in a network of tunnels that connected 14 major cave complexes across a 2-mile stretch. These weren't ordinary defensive positions. Japanese engineers had spent 18 months transforming natural caverns into fortress systems with multiple entrance points, ventilation shafts, and interconnected passageways that allowed troops to vanish from one opening and emerge from another 100 yards away. The caves sat 30 to 70 feet above sea level, carved into coral that American explosives barely dented. Artillery shells from the 155mm howitzers of the 11th Marines had pounded the ridge for 6 days straight, each gun firing 12 rounds per hour, and still the enemy emerged at dusk to harass American positions with Type 92 heavy machine guns and knee mortars. Traditional assault tactics had failed spectacularly. On January 8th, a rifle company from the 5th Marines attempted a frontal assault on Cave Complex 7, advancing with Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges packed with 40 pounds of Composition C2 explosive. The Japanese waited until the Marines closed to within 15 yards before unleashing a murderous crossfire from hidden firing ports. 32 men fell in the first 90 seconds. The survivors retreated, dragging their wounded through coral gravel that shredded uniforms and skin alike. The caves remained untaken. Brendan had seen similar stalemates on Tarawa and Saipan, but Peleliu's geography made it worse. The coral absorbed blast energy like a sponge. Demolition teams tried pumping gasoline into cave entrances and igniting it, but the tunnel's natural ventilation dispersed the flames before they could penetrate deep enough to be effective. Flamethrower teams using the M1A1 model had achieved limited success, but their effective range maxed out at 23 yards, forcing operators to expose themselves to point-blank fire from defenders who knew exactly when to pull their triggers. That changed when Captain Richard Holloway arrived on February 2nd with a convoy of 6 M4 Sherman tanks modified by the 3rd Amphibian Tractor Battalion's maintenance unit. Holloway, a 34-year-old engineer from Pittsburgh who'd worked in steel foundries before the war, had spent 3 months at Guadalcanal's rear echelon workshops developing something the Marine Corps hadn't officially authorized. The tanks looked standard from a distance, but where the bow-mounted 75mm gun once protruded, there now sat a reinforced nozzle assembly connected to 2 armored fuel tanks mounted inside the crew compartment. Brendan circled one of the tanks, noting the modifications. The fuel tanks, each holding 150 gallons of napalm mixture, sat where ammunition racks once resided. The mixture itself was an evolution, a combination of gasoline thickened with aluminum naphthenate and palmitate compounds that created a gel-like substance. Unlike the liquid gasoline of earlier flamethrowers, this napalm stuck to whatever it touched and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The nozzle, fabricated from heat-resistant chromium steel, measured 4 inches in diameter and connected to a pressurization system powered by the tank's auxiliary engine. Holloway climbed onto the turret, his khaki uniform stained with grease and coral dust. He'd run 43 test fires at the Guadalcanal proving grounds, adjusting nitrogen pressure regulators and fuel flow rates until he achieved something remarkable. The standard M1A1 backpack flamethrower carried 5 gallons and managed 23 yards for 8 seconds. His tank-mounted system could project a continuous stream for 90 seconds at distances up to 42 yards, with enough fuel for 3 full burns. But Brendan's concern centered on practicality. The tanks weighed 33 tons, and Peleliu's narrow trails, carved from coral by Japanese labor details, barely accommodated vehicles half that size. The approaches to Bloody Nose Ridge consisted of jagged limestone formations interspersed with shell craters deep enough to swallow a jeep. Plus, the Japanese had demonstrated brutal efficiency with their Type 3 anti-tank mines, magnetic charges, and suicide squads wielding 22-pound satchel charges. Losing a Sherman to enemy action was one thing, but losing a mobile flamethrower that close to enemy positions risked a catastrophic fuel explosion. Holloway anticipated the objection. His team had reinforced the fuel tanks with 3/4-inch steel plating and surrounded them with fire suppression blankets soaked in asbestos solution. If penetrated, the napalm would drain through vented channels away from the crew compartment, theoretically preventing the fireball scenario that haunted tankers' nightmares. Additionally, each tank carried a 4-man crew trained in emergency bailout procedures that could evacuate the vehicle in under 12 seconds. The first test came on February 6 against Cave Complex 12, a moderate-sized position that housed an estimated 40 defenders. Intelligence from captured documents revealed the cave extended 80 feet into the ridge with 3 chambers connected by a main tunnel. The entrance, roughly 8 feet high and 12 feet wide, sat 40 feet up a near-vertical slope of loose coral and volcanic rock. Previous assaults had stalled because riflemen couldn't maintain footing on the incline while under fire, and demolition teams couldn't get close enough to place charges effectively. Brendan positioned 2 rifle platoons from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion 7th Marines on the flanks with orders to suppress any fire from adjacent caves. 3 M4 Shermans with standard armament took overwatch positions 300 yards back, their 75mm guns loaded with high explosive shells ready to engage any anti-tank teams. At 0800 hours, Holloway's modified Sherman, designated Flame 1, ground forward at 4 miles per hour, its engine growling as the driver, Corporal Dennis Hartley from Nebraska, navigated between coral outcroppings. The Japanese held their fire with disciplined patience, a tactic that had served them well against previous assaults. They understood that premature shooting revealed positions and drew counter-battery fire. Better to wait until the Americans commit fully, then unleash everything at point-blank range where volume of fire mattered more than accuracy. Inside Cave Complex 12, Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto of the 2nd Infantry Regiment crouched behind a barricade of sandbags and coral rubble, his Type 99 rifle loaded with a 5-round stripper clip. 16 men occupied the forward chamber with him, armed with rifles, grenades, and 2 Type 96 light machine guns positioned to create a crossfire that covered the entire cave mouth. Yamamoto had survived Guadalcanal and New Guinea, earning promotion through attrition as more senior men died. He'd seen American flamethrowers before, the teams of 2 men carrying 70 pounds of equipment and vulnerable to focused rifle fire. Standard doctrine called for killing the operator first, but if he got within range, retreating to secondary positions until the 8-second burn exhausted itself. The cave's depth provided multiple fallback points, and the Americans rarely pursued into the darkness where defenders held every advantage. At 100 yards, Flame 1 crossed a terrain marker, a shattered palm tree that Easy Company used as a reference point. Still no enemy fire. Holloway, positioned in the tank commander's cupola, scanned the ridgeline through field glasses.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He spotted 2 probable firing positions in adjacent caves, dark, rectangular voids in the coral face, but his mission focused on Complex 12. At 50 yards, he ordered Hartley to angle 15 degrees left, positioning the tank's bow toward the target cave while keeping the thickest armor, the frontal glacis plate at 3 inches thick, facing the most likely threat vectors. The tank's treads chewed through loose coral, occasionally spinning before regaining traction. Inside, the crew worked in practiced synchronization. Private First Class Eugene Miller, the gunner from Ohio, monitored the fuel pressure gauge, ensuring the nitrogen tanks maintained 120 psi. Too low and the napalm wouldn't reach full distance, too high and the nozzle assembly risked rupture. Corporal Vincent Shaw, the loader-turned-fuel systems operator, verified that both feed lines showed green on their flow indicators, meaning no blockages or kinks restricted the napalm's path from storage tanks to nozzle. At 30 yards, Yamamoto made his decision. The tank presented an unusual profile with that strange protrusion where the main gun should be, but it was still a tank and therefore a priority target. He barked orders in rapid Japanese, and the cave mouth erupted with muzzle flashes. Rifle rounds spanged off the Sherman's armor like metallic hail, the sound inside amplified to deafening levels even through the crew's padded helmets. The Type 96 machine guns added their harsh chatter, firing 6.5mm rounds at 500 per minute, creating a sustained roar that seemed to vibrate the air itself. Holloway ducked instinctively as tracers whipped past his cupola, then keyed his radio. Easy Company's riflemen opened up from the flanks, their M1 Garand rifles and Browning automatic rifles stitching the coral around the cave entrance. The suppressing fire forced the Japanese machine gunners to shift positions, buying precious seconds. At 25 yards, Hartley stopped the tank, angling it slightly upward to elevate the nozzle toward the cave mouth 40 feet above. Holloway's voice came through the intercom system, calm despite the chaos. Fire. Shaw pulled the ignition lever while simultaneously opening the fuel valve. The system activated with a throaty whoosh as pressurized napalm surged through the feed lines. The igniter, using the same principle as a diesel engine's glow plug, superheated a small chamber at the nozzle tip to 1,000 degrees. When the napalm gel passed through, it ignited instantly, transforming from viscous liquid to roaring flame in a millisecond. The stream that erupted from Flame 1 defied what Yamamoto understood about American capabilities. It wasn't the stuttering, relatively short-range burst he'd seen before. This was a continuous torrent of orange and yellow fire that arced through the air like dragon's breath made manifest, covering the distance to the cave entrance in under 2 seconds. The napalm gel, propelled by nitrogen pressure and given coherence by its thickened composition, maintained integrity across 40 yards, arriving at the cave mouth still burning at full intensity. Yamamoto's world turned to fire. The napalm splashed across the sandbag barricade and kept coming, flowing over and around obstacles with the persistence of water, but carrying temperatures that ignited everything organic. Men screamed, not the sharp cries of bullet wounds, but the primal shrieks of those experiencing burns that went beyond 3rd degree into charred tissue and exposed bone. The forward chamber filled with flame as napalm dripped from the ceiling and pooled on the floor, creating a conflagration that consumed oxygen faster than the cave's ventilation could replace it. Yamamoto stumbled backward, his uniform smoldering, eyes streaming from smoke thick enough to blind. The heat drove defenders deeper into the cave's secondary chamber, but the napalm kept coming. Holloway maintained the burn for 15 seconds, sweeping the nozzle across the cave entrance in a methodical pattern that ensured coverage of every visible opening. When he released the trigger, 90 gallons of napalm had been expended, coating the cave's interior surfaces with burning gel that would continue igniting for another 3 to 4 minutes. The immediate effect was obvious. No more muzzle flashes came from Complex 12. The sustained fire had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the crackle of flames and occasional muffled sounds that might have been voices or simply the cave's structure settling. But Holloway had learned from Guadalcanal trials that immediate silence didn't guarantee elimination. Defenders could retreat to deeper chambers, wait out the flames, then return once the fire died. Complete suppression required follow-through. He waited 60 seconds, allowing the initial burn to subside, then ordered a second discharge. Shaw complied, sending another sustained stream into the cave mouth. This burn lasted 20 seconds, pouring additional napalm into spaces the first application might have missed. The fire now penetrated beyond the entrance chamber, following the oxygen flow through connecting tunnels. In the depths of Complex 12, Yamamoto and 9 survivors huddled in the third chamber 80 feet from daylight. The heat was unbearable even at this distance, and smoke filled the tunnel, making each breath an exercise in drowning on dry land. The ventilation shafts that had been a defensive advantage now became a liability. Designed to provide fresh air and allow smoke from cooking fires to escape, they now drew the superheated air and smoke deeper into the cave system. Temperatures in the middle chamber exceeded 300 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to blister exposed skin and ignite stored ammunition. A box of grenades cooked off, the explosions muffled by distance but adding to the chaos and terror. Yamamoto faced an impossible choice that broke every tenet of his training. Imperial doctrine emphasized death before surrender, fighting to the last man, last bullet, last breath. Officers carried Type 26 revolvers with instructions to shoot any subordinate who suggested capitulation. But those doctrines assumed combat conditions where death came quickly, not this prolonged asphyxiation in darkness while flames approached from every direction. 3 men were already unconscious from smoke inhalation, their bodies limp against the coral floor. Others coughed blood, their lungs seared by superheated air. The sergeant made his decision. He ordered the 2 healthiest men to help carry the unconscious, then led his group away from the flanks toward an auxiliary exit, a narrow crack in the cave's rear wall that emerged 300 yards east on the reverse slope of the ridge. This escape route had been prepared for exactly this scenario, though planners had envisioned retreating from conventional assault, not fleeing an inferno that followed them through stone corridors. They emerged into daylight 20 minutes later, smoke-blackened and gasping, directly into the sights of a marine listening post from Fox Company that had been positioned to catch exactly this kind of movement. The Marines, initially shocked to see Japanese soldiers appear from what they thought was solid rock, recovered quickly and called for surrender in broken Japanese learned from phrasebooks. Yamamoto, beyond caring about honor or doctrine, simply raised his hands, his Type 99 rifle left behind in the flames. His men followed suit.
Not one reached for a weapon. Brendan, monitoring the operation from his command post 400 yards back, received the report with cautious optimism. 10 prisoners from a cave estimated to hold 40 meant either 30 had died in the flames or more remained inside, perhaps in sections the napalm hadn't reached. Standard procedure called for waiting 24 hours, allowing any survivors to either die from residual effects or emerge voluntarily before sending in teams to verify the cave's neutralization. Those 24 hours revealed the weapon's full effectiveness. Throughout the night, sporadically, small groups of Japanese soldiers emerged from Complex 12's various exits. They came in 2s and 3s, burned, blinded, or simply broken by hours trapped in darkness with the smell of roasted human flesh thick enough to taste. By dawn of February 7th, 37 prisoners had been collected, including Yamamoto. 3 more bodies were found in the cave's entrance chamber when engineers finally deemed it safe to investigate. And forensic evidence suggested another 8 to 10 had died in the deeper sections, though the intense heat had cremated remains to ash and bone fragments. The operation's success metrics spoke for themselves. Complex 12, which had resisted 6 previous assault attempts over 4 weeks, costing 22 Marine casualties with no confirmed enemy kills, had been neutralized in under 2 hours with 0 friendly losses and 40+ enemy either captured or confirmed dead. The ratio represented a dramatic shift in the brutal mathematics of cave warfare that had made every Pacific island a bloodbath. Word spread through the division with the speed of a tropical rainstorm. Other rifle companies, bogged down in their own stalemates against fortified positions, requested flamethrower tank support. Brandon, recognizing a tactical revolution when it materialized, authorized Holloway to proceed with the remaining 5 modified Shermans. Over the next week, his crews systematically addressed every major cave complex on Bloody Nose Ridge, refining their techniques with each engagement. They learned that preliminary suppression fire from standard tanks and infantry was essential to protect the flamethrower vehicle during its approach. They discovered that 2 medium burns of 15 seconds each proved more effective than 1 long discharge, allowing time between applications for smoke to clear enough to observe results and adjust aim.
They found that targeting ventilation shafts with napalm created a chimney effect that drew flames deeper into cave systems, reaching chambers that couldn't be hit directly. By February 14th, 11 major cave complexes had been engaged with flamethrower tanks. 9 had been completely neutralized, their defenders either killed or captured. 2 required follow-up assaults by infantry, but even these proved far less costly than previous attempts because the flames had driven defenders to rear positions, away from optimally prepared firing points at cave entrances. Total Marine casualties from these 11 engagements amounted to 4 wounded, none killed. Japanese losses exceeded 400, split roughly evenly between dead and captured. The psychological impact matched the physical effectiveness. Captured prisoners, interrogated by Japanese-speaking intelligence officers from the 1st Marine Division's language section, revealed a common theme. They'd been trained to face every conventional weapon in the American arsenal, but nobody had prepared them for the reality of 40-yard flame streams that turned defensive positions into crematoriums. The experience broke something fundamental in their tactical confidence, the certainty that coral fortifications provided adequate protection against anything the enemy could deploy. Private Kenji Matsuda crouched in the entrance of Cave Complex 19, his hands trembling as he loaded another 5-round clip into his Type 38 rifle. The weapon, a relic from the Russo-Japanese War 4 decades earlier, still functioned reliably despite the coral dust that infiltrated every mechanism. Matsuda was 19 years old, conscripted from his family's rice farm outside Hiroshima 8 months ago, rushed through 3 weeks of basic training, and shipped to Peleliu with replacement troops in November. He'd arrived expecting to defend the island against an invasion that had already happened, walking into the tail end of a battle that higher command insisted was still winnable. The cave he occupied with 42 other soldiers sat in the northern section of Bloody Nose Ridge, overlooking a valley the Americans had taken in the first week of fighting. From his position, Matsuda could see the enemy's rear areas spreading across former Japanese positions like mold consuming bread. Supply dumps stacked with crates and barrels, maintenance tents where mechanics worked on vehicles, even a field hospital with white canvas marked by red crosses. American wealth on display, the material abundance that made this war feel increasingly futile to men subsisting on quarter rations and rainwater collected in helmets. Lieutenant Hideaki Ota, the cave's commanding officer, maintained discipline through a mixture of Bushido rhetoric and pragmatic violence. 2 days ago, he'd shot Private Suzuki in the head for suggesting they consider terms. The Type 14 pistol's 8mm round entering beneath Suzuki's left eye and exiting through the base of his skull in a spray that painted the cave wall. The body still lay where it fell, beginning to bloat in the tropical heat, a reminder that death from American weapons at least came with the possibility of glory, while death from Ota's pistol carried only shame. Matsuda had witnessed the flamethrower tank's work 3 days prior when it engaged Complex 16, visible from his position across a 1,000-yard gap. He'd watched through captured American binoculars as the modified Sherman approached, smaller than their own Type 97 medium tanks but moving with mechanical confidence. The stream of fire that erupted seemed impossible, a reach that exceeded anything in his training manuals or the defensive briefings that Captain Iwamoto had conducted back when the regiment still had officers above platoon level. Complex 16 had been home to 60 men from the 3rd Battalion, dug into a position that American artillery had pounded for 2 weeks without effect. The flamethrower needed 15 minutes to silence it completely. Matsuda watched survivors stagger from side exits, some with uniforms burning, others blind and groping at air, all moving with the disjointed motions of men whose nervous systems had been overloaded by trauma. The Marines had collected them without firing a shot, herding them toward the rear like farmers gathering livestock. 16's commander, a veteran sergeant named Kobayashi who'd fought in China and earned a reputation for ferocity, surrendered with his hands raised high and his sword left behind. That image haunted Matsuda more than the flames themselves. Kobayashi had lectured replacement troops on the sacred duty to die rather than submit, on the emperor's divine right to their ultimate sacrifice, on the shame that would follow their families for generations if they dishonored the uniform. Yet when fire reached beyond what doctrine said was possible, when the defensive position that promised security became a furnace, Kobayashi chose life. The contradiction nodded everything Matsuda had been taught to believe about courage and duty. Lieutenant Ota, observing the same engagement from a different angle, reached a different conclusion. He called an assembly in Complex 19's main chamber and spoke for 20 minutes about renewed determination, about accepting martyrdom as the only honorable path, about the coming counteroffensive that would drive the Americans back into the sea. He distributed the last of the sake rations, 2 ounces per man, and led them in singing the regimental anthem until the cave walls seemed to vibrate with their voices. Then he ordered work parties to construct additional barricades at the entrance, using coral rubble and the few remaining sandbags to create overlapping positions that could maintain fire even as sections were overrun. The preparations took 2 days, during which American activity in the valley below increased noticeably. More tanks arrived on transporters, regular Shermans, and some with unusual configurations that suggested specialized purposes. Infantry companies rotated through, the fresh troops identifiable by uniforms not yet bleached by sun and stained by combat. Supply trucks came and went in steady streams, bringing ammunition, fuel, rations, all the material advantages that let Americans approach warfare as an industrial problem, rather than a test of spirit. On the morning of February 16th, Matsuda's watch position at the cave entrance provided the first warning. Movement on the valley floor, vehicles forming up in what looked like an assault configuration. 3 standard Shermans taking positions along a ridgeline 800 yards out, their 75mm guns elevated toward the cave complex. Behind them, 2 more tanks with those modified turrets, the flamethrower systems that had become objects of whispered dread among the garrison. Infantry squads, perhaps 60 Marines total, spread out in a skirmish line that suggested supporting roles rather than primary assault.
Ota received the report and issued orders that everyone had known were coming since Complex 16 fell. All personnel to fighting positions, weapons loaded, grenades distributed. The Type 92 heavy machine gun, their most potent defensive weapon at 7.7mm caliber and 450 rounds per minute, was repositioned to cover the approach route the flamethrower tanks would most likely use. Riflemen filled firing positions that had been carved into the cave mouth's perimeter, each man assigned a sector with interlocking fields of fire that theoretically prevented any approach within 100 yards. The Americans opened with artillery, though not the sustained bombardment of previous engagements. Instead, the 3 covering Shermans fired methodically, 1 round every 30 seconds, walking their high-explosive shells across the cave entrance and surrounding area. The bombardment served multiple purposes beyond simple destruction. It forced defenders to keep their heads down, preventing accurate observation of American movements. It cratered the ground, creating obstacles that would slow any counterattack. Most importantly, it created smoke and dust that obscured visibility, letting the flamethrower tanks advance under a curtain of obscuration. Matsuda, pressed against the coral wall of his firing position, felt each shell impact as a physical blow transmitted through the stone. Fragments whined overhead, and limestone chips stung his face as near misses sent shrapnel spraying through the cave entrance. The bombardment lasted 12 minutes by his watch, a Japanese-made timepiece his father had given him before deployment with instructions to return it when the war ended. Those instructions felt increasingly hypothetical as another shell burst 30 feet from his position, the overpressure making his ears ring and his vision blur. When the shelling ceased, silence rushed in like water filling a void. Ota's voice cut through the ringing in everyone's ears, ordering weapons ready and eyes on sectors. Matsuda blinked dust from his vision and peered through his assigned firing slit, a gap between 2 coral blocks that provided a narrow view of the approach route. Through the settling smoke, he saw the first flamethrower tank grinding forward at the slow, deliberate pace he'd observed 3 days earlier. Behind it, a second identical vehicle followed at 50-yard intervals, ensuring that if the first was disabled, the second could continue the mission. The Type 92 crew, positioned 20 feet to Matsuda's left, had the same view. Their gunner, a corporal from Osaka whose name Matsuda had never learned, sighted carefully through the weapon's optical scope and waited for the tank to enter optimal range.
Japanese doctrine for engaging armor emphasized patience, letting targets close to distances where lighter weapons could achieve penetration or at least mission kills through track damage or vision block destruction. The Type 92, firing armor-piercing rounds, could theoretically penetrate Sherman's side armor at 400 yards, though frontal shots required much closer range to exploit weaker points around the driver's vision port. At 600 yards, the machine gun opened fire, its distinctive slow chatter entirely different from the faster American weapons. Tracer rounds, every fifth bullet coated with phosphorus compound, arced toward the approaching tank in lazy red streaks that looked almost gentle until they impacted armor in showers of sparks. The tank kept coming, apparently undamaged, while the covering Shermans immediately responded with high explosive shells aimed at the machine gun's muzzle flash. The first round missed by 20 feet, but the second struck the coral outcropping above the position, dropping several hundred pounds of limestone directly on the gun and its three-man crew. Matsuda heard the screams, abruptly cut off, and knew the machine gun was gone. Their heaviest weapon eliminated in under a minute, leaving only rifles and grenades to contest what came next. Around the cave entrance, other riflemen opened fire at 500 yards, their Type 38s cracking in a ragged fusillade that demonstrated desperation more than tactical sense. The 6.5mm rounds, effective against unarmored targets, simply bounced off the Sherman's frontal armor without achieving anything except announcing their positions to the American infantry, who returned fire with their semi-automatic Garens and full-automatic BARs. Lieutenant Ota moved through the cave's interior, his pistol drawn not for engaging the enemy, but for enforcing his will on the garrison. He stopped behind each fighting position, offering words of encouragement to some men and cold stares to others, making clear that retreat from assigned positions would be met with immediate execution. Matsuda felt the officer's presence behind him but didn't turn, keeping his attention on the approaching tank now at 400 yards and closing steadily. The flamethrower vehicle, designated Flame 3 by its crew, navigated terrain that would have challenged a mountain goat. Loose coral shifted under its 33-ton weight, forcing driver Corporal Anthony DeLuca to constantly adjust his track controls to maintain forward momentum. Inside the crew compartment, the temperature exceeded 100 degrees, despite ventilation fans running at maximum. The fuel operator, Private Kenneth Walsh from Boston, monitored his gauges with the focus of a watchmaker, noting that both napalm tanks registered full and pressurization systems showed optimal readings. Tank Commander, Staff Sergeant Robert Hendricks, a veteran of Tarawa and Saipan, observed the target cave through his cupola's vision blocks while maintaining radio contact with the covering tanks and infantry support. He'd conducted 17 flamethrower operations in the past 2 weeks, enough to develop an intuitive sense for timing and positioning. The Japanese defenders followed predictable patterns, holding fire until ranges close to where their weapons might achieve effect, then unleashing everything in concentrated bursts that relied more on volume than accuracy. At 300 yards, Hendricks ordered DeLuca to angle slightly left, positioning the Sherman's frontal armor toward the cave mouth, while keeping the flamethrower nozzle aligned with the target. The maneuver also placed a coral outcropping between Flame 3 and a suspected secondary firing position that intelligence photos suggested might house anti-tank weapons. The Japanese had demonstrated unpleasant creativity with their shaped charge mines and magnetic attachments, turning individual soldiers into guided missiles willing to die if it meant disabling a tank. Rifle fire intensified as range decreased, the Japanese clearly understanding this was their last opportunity to prevent what followed. Bullets sparked off armor and rang against the turret like hailstones on a tin roof. One round found the narrow gap between the turret and hull, ricocheting through the interior and creasing Walsh's shoulder before embedding itself in the fuel tank's armor plating. The private cursed, slapped a hand over the bleeding wound, and kept his other hand on the fuel controls because leaving his station wasn't an option when the alternative was burning alive if systems failed. At 150 yards, a Japanese soldier broke from the cave entrance sprinting down slope with a satchel charge held overhead like an offering to vengeful gods. American infantry spotted him immediately, and a dozen Garand rifles barked simultaneously. The soldier managed another 5 steps before multiple hits spun him sideways and dropped him face first into coral gravel. The satchel charge, poorly fused or damaged by bullets, detonated 5 seconds later in a blast that scattered dirt and body parts but threatened nothing except the morale of anyone watching. Hendricks barely registered the suicide attempt, his attention fixed on positioning. At 100 yards, he ordered DeLuca to halt and confirmed elevation angle with his gunner, whose normal job of ranging targets translated effectively to ensuring the flamethrower nozzle aimed at the correct trajectory. The cave entrance sat approximately 35 feet above their current position, requiring a 15-degree upward angle to achieve optimal napalm dispersion across the opening and into the interior chambers beyond. Inside Complex 19, Mitsuda watched the tank stop and felt his bowels turn to water. He'd seen this before from across the valley, knew what came next, yet his body refused to move from its assigned position, despite every survival instinct screaming at him to run. Lieutenant Ota's presence somewhere behind him helped maintain that paralysis, the certain death from disobedience weighing against the probable death from staying. Other defenders faced the same calculation, frozen in firing positions as the Sherman's unusual turret rotation brought its nozzle to bear. The first discharge erupted with a sound like ripping canvas amplified 1,000 times. Napalm gel, pressurized to 120 psi and ignited at the nozzle by superheated elements, launched from the tank in a coherent stream that crossed 100 yards in under 3 seconds. To Mitsuda, time seemed to distort, the fire moving both impossibly fast and with dreamlike slowness, a contradiction his mind couldn't reconcile.
The stream arced upward, following ballistic physics, climbing to 35 feet before splashing across the cave entrance in a wave of flame that immediately began flowing inward, following the path of least resistance into the tunnel complex. The heat arrived before the flames, a wall of superheated air that flash-boiled the moisture from Masuda's eyes and seared his lungs with his next breath. He stumbled backward, rifle forgotten, hands raised instinctively to protect his face from temperatures that made the tropical sun feel like cool shade by comparison. Around him, other defenders abandoned their positions in a chaos of screaming men and discarded weapons, military discipline dissolving under assault by an element that cared nothing for courage or duty. Hendricks maintained the burn for 20 seconds, sweeping the nozzle across the cave entrance in overlapping patterns that ensured complete coverage. Napalm splashed off coral and dripped from the cave's upper surfaces, creating secondary ignition points that spread fire laterally and vertically. The gel's adhesive properties meant it stuck to stone and continued burning, transforming every surface into a heat source that radiated energy in all directions. When he released the trigger, roughly 75 gallons of napalm had been expended, coating the cave's entrance chamber and main tunnel with burning gel that would continue at full intensity for another 3 to 4 minutes. The screaming started immediately, sounds that carried across the 100 yards separating tank from cave, even over the roar of flames. Hendricks had heard those sounds 17 times now and still felt his stomach clench at their raw animal terror. He waited 45 seconds, allowing smoke to clear enough for observation, then triggered a second burn. This discharge lasted 15 seconds and targeted deeper into the cave mouth, pushing flames beyond the entrance chamber into connecting tunnels where defenders might have retreated to escape the first application. Masuda ran blindly through smoke so thick it was like swimming through ink. The cave's interior had become a maze of fire and darkness, familiar passages rendered alien by the absence of light and presence of flame. He collided with another soldier, possibly Private Tanaka from his squad, and they clung to each other for a moment before staggering separately deeper into the complex. Behind them, the main tunnel roared with combustion, oxygen being consumed faster than ventilation shafts could replace it, creating a wind that pulled toward the flames and made movement away from them feel like wading through water. Lieutenant Oda had retreated to the cave's deepest chamber, a space carved 80 feet into the ridge that served as command post and final redoubt.
20 men gathered there, coughing and retching as smoke filtered through connecting passages. The officer's uniform was singed, and his face bore the red flush of flash burns, but his pistol remained holstered, and his expression maintained the rigid control that had characterized his command. He ordered the chamber sealed, directing men to collapse a section of tunnel using demolition charges that had been pre-positioned for exactly this contingency. The explosion, muffled by distance and stone, dropped several tons of coral rubble into the connecting passage, creating a barrier that blocked both flames and smoke from reaching the deepest chamber. It also trapped everyone inside with no exit except back through fire or forward through a narrow emergency tunnel that emerged on the ridge's reverse slope, 200 yards from the main entrance. Oda had prepared for siege, not cremation, and his contingency planning assumed Americans would eventually withdraw, allowing survivors to sally forth during darkness and either counterattack or retreat to other positions. That planning hadn't accounted for the flamethrowers' persistence. Hendricks, observing from Flame 3's cupola, noted that fire still poured from the cave entrance, but no return fire or movement suggested remaining resistance in the forward sections. Standard procedure called for a third burn to ensure deep penetration, so he ordered his crew to prepare for final discharge. Walsh, his shoulder now bandaged with strips torn from his undershirt, confirmed fuel pressure and flow systems remained nominal despite his wound. The tank carried enough napalm for one more full-duration burn, with perhaps 15 seconds of fuel remaining afterward for spot applications if needed. The third stream launched at 09:45 hours, precisely 12 minutes after the initial engagement began. This burn lasted 30 seconds and targeted the cave's ventilation shafts, visible as dark spots in the coral face above and to the sides of the main entrance. Napalm splashed into these openings, and gravity carried burning gel downward through vertical shafts into the cave's deeper sections. The chimney effect worked in reverse, drawing flames and superheated air down into chambers that had previously seemed protected by distance from the entrance. In the sealed deepest chamber, the temperature began rising despite the collapsed tunnel that separated them from the main fire. The ventilation shafts, designed to provide fresh air and exhaust smoke from cooking fires, now deliver heat and combustion byproducts directly into their sanctuary. Within minutes, the air temperature climbed past 140 degrees Fahrenheit, approaching levels that caused heat exhaustion and eventually heat stroke in men already dehydrated from weeks of inadequate water rations. Lieutenant Oda called for volunteers to attempt the emergency exit tunnel, a passage so narrow that men would need to crawl single file through 80 feet of claustrophobic darkness before emerging into daylight and probable American fire. No one moved. The prospect of crawling through stone while temperatures climbed and oxygen depleted created a unique horror that somehow exceeded even the fear of bullets or capture. Oda drew his pistol, not to threaten but to check its ammunition, and found he'd expended 4 of the weapon's 7 rounds on earlier disciplinary actions. 3 bullets for himself and 2 subordinates, if it came to that, insufficient for the 20 men now looking to him for leadership that he no longer knew how to provide. Above ground, Hendricks dismounted from Flame 3 and conferred with the infantry company commander, Captain Donald Pierce, about follow-up procedures. Standard doctrine called for waiting 12 hours before sending teams to investigate cave interiors, allowing time for fires to burn out and air to clear of toxic gases. Pierce positioned his Marines in a perimeter around Complex 19's known exits, with orders to call for surrender in Japanese if anyone emerged, but to fire if they showed weapons or threatening behavior. The waiting period stretched through the afternoon and into evening, during which other operations continued across the ridge. Flame 4 and Flame 5 engaged Complexes 21 and 23 with similar results, each cave silent after concentrated napalm application. By sunset, only 5 major cave systems remained active on Bloody Nose Ridge, compared to the 19 that had been occupied when the flamethrower tanks first deployed. The pace of reduction had accelerated beyond anyone's initial projections, suggesting that total neutralization of the ridge might be achieved within another week, rather than the months that conventional methods would have required. At Complex 19, the first emergence occurred at 2100 hours, full darkness, with only starlight and the distant glow of American campfires for illumination. A figure appeared at the emergency exit, crawling from the narrow tunnel mouth and collapsing onto rocky ground. Marine sentries, using night vision techniques learned through months of Pacific combat, spotted the movement and issued challenges in Japanese. The figure, later identified as Private Masuda, raised his hands and called out the surrender phrase from leaflets that had been distributed throughout Japanese positions. "I give up. Please treat me well." Over the next 3 hours, 17 more soldiers emerged from the same exit, including Lieutenant Oda, who had waited until last before making the decision to evacuate the trapped survivors. The officer had spent the evening in the sealed chamber as temperatures climbed past 160 degrees, watching men collapse from heat exhaustion and making repeated calculations about honor versus survival. In the end, the mathematics proved simple. Staying meant certain death from heat and dehydration within hours. Emerging meant probable capture but possible survival, and somewhere in the balance between Bushido and biology, Oda chose life. The prisoners, processed through the division's interrogation section, provided information that intelligence officers found both valuable and disturbing. Valuable because it confirmed the flamethrower's effectiveness exceeded even optimistic assessments, with psychological impact matching physical destruction. Disturbing because their accounts of conditions inside caves under napalm attack revealed suffering that even hardened veterans found difficult to contemplate without emotional response. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.